I was 24 in 1975, renting a small one-bedroom place in the Selwood neighborhood of Portland. It wasn't anything special, just an older house that had been split into units. But I liked it because it was cheap and close to downtown. I worked at a record store nearby, so most days I'd walk or bike to work. My routine was pretty ordinary. Work during the day, grab groceries, then come home to read or put on some vinyl. Nothing about my life felt particularly unusual until one week in late fall. That's when I first noticed the man in the coat. It was a long, dark wool coat, the kind you'd expect to see someone wearing in the dead of winter. But this was October, and while it was chilly, it wasn't that cold. He was tall, a little lanky, and always had his hands buried deep in his pockets. The first time I saw him, he was standing under a street lamp near 13th Avenue, not doing anything, just standing. I figured maybe he was waiting for someone or for the bus, though there wasn't a stop right there. Over the next few days, I realized it wasn't a one-time thing. Each night when I came home from work, I'd spot him somewhere in the neighborhood. Sometimes he was pacing up the block, sometimes just lingering on a corner, but always in that same coat. What struck me as odd was that he never seemed to interact with anyone. He didn't smoke, didn't carry groceries, didn't even look like he was walking to a destination. He just appeared around the area night after night, like he had nowhere else to go. At first I brushed it off as a strange quirk of city life, but soon it started to feel different. By the end of that week, I couldn't ignore him anymore. It wasn't just the fact that he was there every night. It was that he seemed to be in the same general area as me. If I walked down Southeast Tacoma Street toward my apartment, I'd notice him a block or two ahead. If I cut through one of the side streets, somehow he'd be there too, like he had adjusted his route. I tried telling myself it was just coincidence, but it got harder to believe that when it kept happening. One night, I decided to test it. Instead of going straight home after work, I walked past my block and kept going toward Oaks Park. It was dark and mostly empty that late, and I figured if the man showed up again, then it wasn't just in my head. Sure enough, about 10 minutes into my walk, I looked behind me and saw that same coat, the same slow stride, about half a block back. My stomach dropped. He wasn't close enough to confront, but he wasn't far enough to ignore. I turned around and made my way home quickly, locking the door behind me for the first time in months. After that, I started noticing other little details. Once, when I stepped out to take the trash to the alley, I could swear I saw him standing at the end of the street, just staring. Another time, while walking home, I passed him standing in front of a closed laundromat, and as I glanced at him, he slowly turned his head to follow me with his eyes. He never said anything, never moved toward me, but the silence made it worse. It was like he was waiting for something, and I didn't know what. The final time I saw him was the night I decided I couldn't just keep ignoring it. I left work later than usual, and the streets were quieter than normal. As I turned onto my block, I saw the man standing across the street from my building, under a flickering streetlight. He wasn't pacing or walking, just standing there, face in my direction. The coat hung heavy on him, and I couldn't see his face in the dark, but I knew he was watching me. I froze for a second, then forced myself to walk toward my apartment door, pretending not to notice him. When I got inside, I stood by the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. He was still there, Minutes passed, then maybe close to an hour, and he didn't move. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? A man in a coat was standing across the street. In the end, I just stayed in the dark, sitting on the floor near the window, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I looked again, he was gone. A couple days later, I was walking home from the corner store when I saw a city crew replacing the streetlight outside my building. The repairman was talking to a neighbor, saying someone had thrown rocks at it until it finally broke. I don't know if it was him, but I never saw the man in the long coat again after that night. Still, for months after, every time I walked home, I'd feel that same crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like he could be just around the corner, watching. I grew up in Budapest in the 1970s, in one of those big old apartment buildings with a shared courtyard and basement storage units for each family. My parents and I lived on the third floor, and the basement was mostly used for bicycles, coal, and boxes of things people didn't want to throw away. It always smelled a little damp, and as a kid, I hated going down there alone. By the time I was a teenager in 1975, I was used to it. But I still didn't linger down there longer than I had to. One night in late autumn, my father sent me down to the basement to fetch a bag of potatoes we stored there. The light bulb in the hallway was dim and flickered when I pulled the chain. As I walked past the row of storage units, I thought I heard something, like a shift of fabric or someone clearing their throat. I froze, waiting, but after a few seconds of silence, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I grabbed the potatoes quickly and went back upstairs. A few days later, one of the neighbors mentioned to my father that she thought someone had been sneaking into the basement. She said she'd noticed her lock was scratched up, and she swore she'd heard footsteps when she was down there hanging laundry. My father brushed it off at the time, but the idea stuck in my head. The basement had always felt unsettling, and suddenly I had a reason to think maybe it wasn't just me being nervous down there. Not long after, I went downstairs again, this time to help my father move some crates. While we were lifting them, I noticed a blanket tucked behind a stack of old furniture near the far wall. At first, I thought maybe someone had just left it there, but then I saw shoes underneath it, like someone had shoved their belongings into a corner. I didn't say anything right away, but I felt my stomach tighten. It looked too deliberate to be an accident. Later that week, I made an excuse to go back down by myself. I wanted to know if I'd imagined it. Sure enough, the blanket and shoes were still there. And this time I spotted an empty food jar and a tin cup tucked beside the pile. Someone was definitely staying here. I remember backing away quietly, careful not to make a sound, like whoever it was might step out from the shadows at any second. That night at dinner, I told my parents what I had seen. My father frowned, but he didn't want to cause alarm with the neighbors until he was sure. He said he'd check it out in the morning, but I barely slept because I kept picturing that corner of the basement and wondering what would have happened if I'd gone a little closer. If whoever was living there had been sitting just out of sight, watching me. The next morning, my father went downstairs with one of the neighbors. When they came back up, their faces looked pale. They told us the blanket, shoes, and food were gone, but there were clear signs someone had been staying there. The floor was marked where a person had been sleeping, and there were cigarette butts in a tin can. Whoever it was must have realized we were catching on and left during the night. Word spread quickly through the building. A few neighbors admitted they had also heard strange noises or thought they'd seen movement near the basement. But nobody had wanted to say anything. It felt unnerving to realize that while we were all living our everyday lives, someone else had been quietly sharing the same space, sneaking in and out, probably listening to our footsteps above them. To this day, I don't know who it was or how long they had been there. But sometimes, when I go down into that basement, I still glance toward that same corner. It makes me uneasy, thinking about how easily someone managed to live right under our noses, and how close I came to stumbling right into them without anyone else around. Back in 1975, I was in 8th grade at a public school in Fairfax, Virginia. Our English teacher thought it would be a good idea to connect us with pen pals from other schools around the country, partly to practice letter writing and partly to make new friends. I remember being excited about it because I liked the idea of writing to someone I'd never met. And honestly, anything to break up the routine of homework and chores felt exciting at that age. We each got paired with someone randomly through a program she signed us up for, and a couple weeks later, I got my first letter. The envelope was neat, typed out on a typewriter, addressed directly to me. My assigned pen pal said his name was Greg, and he claimed to be from somewhere outside of Chicago. His handwriting looked older than a kid's, but I didn't really think much of it back then. The first letter was pretty normal, just asking me about what music I liked, what classes I was taking, and if I had any pets. I wrote back, answering those questions, and tossed in things about watching Happy Days on TV or listening to records with my friends. I figured it was just harmless. The second letter from him was when it felt a little strange. This time, Greg asked me how my dog was doing. The thing was, in my first letter back to him, I never said I had a dog. I only brought up having a pet. I reread my letter just to check, thinking maybe I mentioned it without realizing. But no, I hadn't written a word about owning a dog. Yet somehow, Greg already knew I had one. I brushed it off as coincidence at first, but deep down, it stuck with me. I decided not to bring it up right away in my reply. Instead, I just answered his other questions and kept it casual. A couple weeks later, another envelope came, again typed out with the same careful lettering. This time, though, Greg mentioned my younger brother by name. That froze me in my tracks. My brother's name wasn't anything common, and I was certain I hadn't brought him up in either of my letters. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the page, trying to figure out how he could have known. When I told one of my friends at school, she thought maybe the teachers had shared some details about us with the pen pals. That explanation made sense for a second, but then I thought back to the dog thing. Even if they'd shared some information, they wouldn't know details like that. My dog wasn't listed anywhere, not even in the little About Me sheet we filled out for the program. I started to feel uneasy every time I saw the mail come in, wondering what the next letter would say. The next letter was the one that really got to me. It was shorter than the others, and after a few simple questions, Greg wrote, "I saw you walking home from school on Tuesday. You usually take the same route, don't you?" My stomach dropped as I read it. Not only had I never told him where I lived, but I always walked the same route home from school. It was only then that I started to feel like this wasn't just some innocent pen pal thing anymore. I didn't tell my parents right away. I think part of me was afraid they'd say I was overreacting, or worse, that they'd take away the pen pal program entirely and make a big deal of it at school. Instead, I showed the letter to my older cousin, who was staying with us for the summer. He read it twice, frowned, and told me not to write back. He said he'd help me keep an eye on the mailbox, and that if another letter came, we'd show my parents. Sure enough, a week later, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten in rushed, uneven script. The return address was gone. Inside was just one sheet of paper with a single sentence. "Why aren't you writing me back, Lisa?" I remember feeling my whole body go cold. I hadn't told him my name in the letters, only signed with the initials we were instructed to use. That's when I finally broke down and showed everything to my mom. She called the school right away. The teacher seemed shocked and said none of the other kids had reported anything strange with their pen pals. They looked into it, and a few days later, they told my mom that the address we'd been sending letters to didn't even belong to a student or anyone enrolled in the program. To this day, I don't know who Greg really was or how he knew those things about me. But when I think back to that last note, I can't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they lived close enough to see me.